darkest winter. December 1944. Western Europe was frozen beneath one of the harshest winters anyone could remember. Snow-buried forests, ice-covered roads. Thick fog swallowed entire armies. The cold was so brutal that rifle bolts froze shut, truck engines refused to start, and wounded soldiers sometimes died before medics could even reach them. Most Americans believed the war in Europe was nearly over. Just 6 months earlier, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. Paris had been liberated. American, British, and Canadian troops had pushed hundreds of miles across France. Newspapers back home were filled with optimistic headlines. Families decorated Christmas trees believing their sons would soon be home. But behind the front lines, another story was unfolding. Deep inside Germany, Adolf Hitler refused to admit defeat. His armies had suffered catastrophic losses on both the eastern and western fronts. German cities were burning under relentless bombing raids. Fuel supplies were disappearing. Factories struggled to replace destroyed tanks and aircraft. Many experienced soldiers had already been killed. Yet Hitler remained convinced that one decisive attack could still change history. He believed the Western Allies were becoming overconfident. Their front stretched across hundreds of miles, and intelligence reports suggested several American divisions occupying a quiet section of Belgium were exhausted after months of continuous fighting. To Hitler, that quiet front wasn't a weakness for Germany. It was an opportunity. His plan would become one of the boldest and most desperate offensives of the entire Second World War. It would later be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. But hidden within this famous battle lies a story many people have never heard. It wasn't simply about tanks smashing through snowy forests. It wasn't only about heroic American defenses at places like Bastogne. It was also the moment when one revolutionary American technology quietly transformed modern warfare forever. A weapon so advanced that many German soldiers had no idea it even existed. A weapon that exploded with terrifying precision in the sky instead of waiting to strike the ground. A weapon capable of destroying entire infantry formations before they even realized they were under attack. That weapon was the proximity fuse. And when it finally appeared over the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the battlefield changed almost overnight. The Ardennes forest had witnessed great armies before. Dense pine trees stretched for miles across Belgium and Luxembourg. Narrow roads twisted between steep hills and frozen valleys. Visibility was limited, especially during winter storms. Military planners often viewed the region as difficult terrain for large offensives. Ironically, that assumption had already proven disastrous once before. In May 1940, German panzer divisions had surprised Allied commanders by attacking through these same forests during the invasion of France. Tanks emerged where many believed tanks could never operate. 4 years later, Hitler intended to repeat history. His objective wasn't merely to slow Allied advances. He wanted something far more ambitious. German armored divisions would punch through American lines, race toward the Belgian port of Antwerp, split British and American forces apart, capture enormous fuel depots, and force the Western Allies into negotiating peace. If successful, Germany could focus everything against the Soviet Union in the East. It was an astonishingly risky gamble, one that depended almost entirely upon surprise. And for a brief moment, it worked. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, silence covered the Ardennes. American soldiers huddled inside foxholes wrapped in blankets. Many believed they occupied one of the safest sectors on the Western Front. Some units had been sent there specifically because they needed rest. Others consisted of inexperienced replacements seeing combat for the first time. But, without warning, the sky erupted. Thousands of German artillery pieces fired almost simultaneously. Shells screamed across the frozen landscape. Entire hillsides exploded. Telephone lines vanished. Observation posts disappeared beneath clouds of dirt and snow. Within minutes, one of the largest artillery bombardments of the war was underway. German infantry advanced through darkness while hundreds of tanks followed behind. Elite Waffen-SS units spearheaded the assault. Veteran panzer divisions punched into American defenses. The offensive stretched across nearly 80 miles. Confusion spread instantly. Many American headquarters couldn't determine exactly where the attack had begun. Radio communication became unreliable. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles. Commanders struggled to identify the main German objective. The enemy seemed to be attacking everywhere at once. For soldiers trapped along the front, the first hours were terrifying. Snow-muffled sound. Fog-concealed movement. German patrols suddenly appeared from forests that had seemed empty only moments earlier. Machine guns echoed between frozen hills. Mortar rounds burst above treetops. Entire companies became separated from neighboring units. Some American positions fought until they exhausted every round of ammunition. Others found themselves completely surrounded before sunrise. Yet despite the surprise, the German advance immediately encountered one unexpected obstacle: American resistance. Small groups of soldiers refused to surrender. Engineers blew bridges just before German tanks could cross. Forward observers directed artillery onto advancing columns despite overwhelming odds. Road junctions became scenes of desperate combat. Every delay mattered. Every hour counted. Because farther behind the lines, the United States Army was beginning to react. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, immediately recognized the seriousness of the attack. Reserve divisions received emergency orders. Fuel trucks were redirected. Airborne units prepared for rapid deployment. Among them stood one of America's most famous formations, the 101st Airborne Division. Within days, these paratroopers would race toward the small Belgian town of Bastogne. There, surrounded on every side, they would write one of the greatest chapters in American military history. But Bastogne represented only one piece of a much larger battle. Across the Ardennes, hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought in scattered forests, frozen villages, and icy fields. It became a battle measured not only by territory, but by endurance. The weather favored Germany. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Snow slowed reinforcements. Fog reduced visibility to only a few hundred yards. German commanders believed nature itself had become an ally. Without Allied air superiority, they expected American forces to collapse under relentless pressure. Initially, that prediction appeared frighteningly accurate. German armored spearheads achieved deep penetrations. Maps inside Allied headquarters suddenly showed a dangerous bulge pushing westward into American lines. It was this protrusion, this giant bulge, that eventually gave the battle its famous name. Newspaper editors back home searched for explanations. Military analysts wondered whether Germany had somehow regained its former strength. Some feared another disaster similar to the fall of France in 1940. American families anxiously waited for news from sons fighting somewhere inside a snow-covered wilderness whose name many had never heard before. The situation appeared critical, but hidden beyond the headlines. American scientists and engineers had already provided something the German high command never anticipated. Not another tank. Not another aircraft. Not another rifle. Instead, a tiny electronic device no larger than a soda can. Inside it were miniature vacuum tubes, delicate circuits, and an astonishing idea. Instead of exploding only after hitting the ground, an artillery shell could now decide the perfect moment to detonate while still flying through the air. The result was devastating. Invisible fragments would rain downward across wide areas. Soldiers hiding behind snowbanks, foxholes, fences, or shallow trenches suddenly found themselves exposed from above. Traditional cover became dangerously inadequate. Entire formations could be shattered within seconds. For years, the Allies had kept this revolutionary technology away from the European battlefield, fearing that unexploded shells might fall into German hands. But December 1944 changed everything. The German offensive was simply too dangerous. The restrictions were lifted. The secret weapon would finally be unleashed against enemy ground forces. And when American artillery batteries received those first shipments, few realized they were about to witness one of the greatest technological surprises of World War II. Because somewhere beyond the snowy tree line, thousands of German soldiers were advancing confidently toward what they believed would be victory. They had no idea that an invisible enemy was waiting in the skies above them. Hitler's last gamble. The German offensive had begun with breathtaking speed. Columns of Panther and Tiger tanks rolled through the snow-covered Ardennes. Assault guns rumbled along frozen roads while thousands of infantrymen marched through forests blanketed in white. Behind them came horse-drawn wagons carrying ammunition, fuel, and supplies, a reminder that despite Germany's reputation for mechanized warfare, much of its army still relied on horses in the final year of the war. For the first few days, it seemed Hitler's gamble might actually succeed. American units were pushed back. Road intersections changed hands repeatedly. Entire battalions found themselves isolated behind enemy lines. Confusion spread across Allied headquarters as commanders struggled to understand the true scale of the assault. But beneath this dramatic advance, Germany was already fighting against time. And time was something Hitler could no longer afford. By December 1944, the German Reich was running on borrowed strength. Its factories still produced impressive weapons, but they lacked the resources needed to sustain a long war. Fuel had become Germany's greatest weakness. Without gasoline, even the most advanced tanks were little more than steel monuments. Many panzer crews received only enough fuel to reach their objectives. They were expected to capture Allied fuel depots along the way. If they failed, their offensive would literally grind to a halt. The situation was so desperate that some German commanders privately questioned whether the operation could even succeed. They knew the numbers. The Allies possessed overwhelming industrial power. American factories produced tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Thousands of trucks crossed Europe carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and replacement parts. Every week brought more soldiers from the United States. Germany simply couldn't replace its losses at the same pace. Still, Hitler refused to accept reality. He believed one massive victory would divide the Allied coalition. He hoped Britain and the United States would lose the political will to continue fighting. It was a strategy built on hope rather than logistics. Yet tens of thousands of German soldiers marched forward believing they could still change history. Among the most feared units in the offensive were the elite Waffen-SS divisions. These formations had earned reputations for aggressive attacks and fierce discipline. They spearheaded many of Germany's armored thrusts toward the Meuse River. One of their commanders, Joachim Paper, led a powerful armored battle group that became famous and infamous during the campaign. His objective was simple: advance as quickly as possible. Avoid unnecessary battles. Capture bridges before American engineers could destroy them. Reach the Meuse River. Then continue toward Antwerp. Speed mattered more than anything else. Every delay reduced Germany's chances of success. At first, Paper's columns achieved remarkable progress. American defensive lines were pierced. Villages fell rapidly. Refugees clogged icy roads alongside retreating military vehicles. Yet almost immediately, unexpected problems began to appear. Traffic. Not Allied attacks. Not enemy tanks. Traffic. The narrow roads of the Ardennes had never been designed to support thousands of military vehicles moving simultaneously. Columns stretched for miles. One disabled truck could halt hundreds of vehicles behind it. Destroyed bridges forced long detours. Snow made maneuvering almost impossible. Engineers worked around the clock trying to clear obstacles while military police attempted to direct endless streams of armor, artillery, supply trucks, and infantry. Every traffic jam became another opportunity for American resistance. Small groups of defenders delayed entire armored columns. A single blown bridge forced hours of repair work. A lone tank knocked out in the middle of a road created enormous bottlenecks. The German timetable slowly began to unravel. Meanwhile, American commanders recovered from the initial shock. Instead of collapsing, many isolated units fought with extraordinary determination. At crossroads, in forests, inside tiny Belgian villages, American soldiers repeatedly chose to stand and fight. Some companies held positions until almost every man became a casualty. Others continued directing artillery fire while surrounded on every side. These seemingly small actions had enormous consequences. Every minute bought precious time for reinforcements. General Eisenhower quickly shifted reserve forces toward the Ardennes. The 82nd Airborne Division entered the fight. The 101st Airborne Division raced toward Bastogne aboard hundreds of trucks. Armored divisions rushed from quieter sectors. Military engineers blew bridges. Artillery units established new firing positions. The American response became one of the fastest large-scale troop movements of the European campaign. Germany had achieved surprise. But surprise alone would not guarantee victory. As Christmas approached, the weather remained Germany's greatest ally. Dense clouds covered the battlefield. Snowstorms reduced visibility to almost nothing. Allied fighter aircraft, normally dominant over Europe, remained grounded. Without constant air attacks, German armored columns moved with greater freedom. Many German officers believed the skies themselves were protecting the offensive, yet hidden within American artillery positions. Another form of firepower was preparing to change everything. Unlike aircraft, artillery didn't need clear skies. It could operate day and night, through fog, through snow, through freezing temperatures. And American artillery crews had become some of the most experienced in the world. By late 1944, they possessed extraordinary coordination. Forward observers hidden near the front used radios to call for fire missions. Within minutes, batteries located miles away could deliver devastating barrages with astonishing accuracy. Entire battalions often fired simultaneously. Shells arrived almost at once despite being launched from different locations. German veterans respected American artillery. Many considered it among the most dangerous weapons they faced. But they still believed they understood how artillery worked. They knew to dive into foxholes, take cover behind embankments, press flat against the frozen earth. Those instincts had saved countless lives earlier in the war. Now, those same instincts would become far less effective. Several months before the Battle of the Bulge, American scientists had solved one of warfare's oldest problems. Traditional artillery shells depended on impact. They exploded only after striking the ground, a tree, or another solid object. The problem was simple. Much of the explosive force disappeared into the earth. Fragments often traveled sideways rather than downward. Soldiers hiding inside trenches or behind natural cover frequently survived. Military engineers wanted something better. They wanted a shell capable of deciding exactly when to explode. Not too early, not too late, at precisely the deadliest moment. The solution sounded almost impossible. Install a miniature radar system inside every artillery shell. As the shell flew through the air, tiny radio waves would constantly measure the distance between the projectile and the ground below. The instant it reached the perfect height, the fuse would trigger automatically. The shell would burst in midair. Thousands of razor-sharp steel fragments would spread outward before raining downward across anyone below. Instead of striking the ground first, death came from above. The engineering challenge was extraordinary. Imagine placing delicate electronics inside an artillery shell launched at nearly 2,000 miles per hour. When fired, the shell experienced forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. Most electronic equipment of the 1940s would simply shatter. American scientists spent years designing rugged miniature vacuum tubes capable of surviving those unimaginable stresses. The final product seemed almost miraculous. Despite violent acceleration, the tiny radar continued functioning perfectly. As the shell approached the Earth, it quietly sensed the changing radio signal. Milliseconds later, the explosion occurred exactly where engineers intended. Today, such technology might seem ordinary. In 1944, it bordered on science fiction. Because the proximity fuse represented such an enormous technological advantage, Allied leaders guarded it with extreme secrecy. For much of the war, commanders prohibited its use over occupied Europe. The fear was obvious. If an unexploded shell landed behind German lines, enemy scientists might recover the fuse, study it, copy it, develop their own version. Instead, proximity-fused shells were initially used against Japanese aircraft over the Pacific Ocean. If they missed, they usually fell harmlessly into the sea. The technology remained protected. But the Battle of the Bulge changed the calculation. The German offensive threatened everything. If the breakthrough succeeded, Allied armies could face their greatest crisis since D-Day. Military leaders decided the risk was now worth taking. Orders went out. The restrictions were lifted. Artillery units in Europe finally received permission to use proximity-fused ammunition against German ground forces. Most American soldiers had little idea they were handling one of the greatest technological breakthroughs of the 20th century. To artillery crews, it looked like another shell. To the men advancing toward them, it would become a nightmare. German infantry continued pushing through frozen forests. Commanders remained confident. Reports arriving at headquarters described captured prisoners, abandoned American vehicles, and advancing armored spearheads. Although delays were becoming more common, many officers still believed success remained possible. Few suspected that an invisible revolution had already arrived on the battlefield. No dramatic new tank appeared. No secret aircraft filled the skies. No enormous superweapon announced itself. Instead, the change came silently, inside ordinary-looking artillery shells. Waiting. Ready. The first time German soldiers experienced their effects, many struggled to understand what had happened. Explosions occurred high above their heads. Trees shattered. Snow erupted into white clouds. Fragments slashed downward from impossible angles. Foxholes offered less protection. Shallow trenches became deadly traps. Entire squads disappeared beneath storms of steel. Some survivors believed American artillery had suddenly become unbelievably accurate. Others thought they faced an entirely new type of ammunition. They were right. But they couldn't yet understand just how revolutionary it truly was. Because the real storm, the one that would devastate advancing German formations and help stop Hitler's final offensive, was only beginning. The secret weapon. By the third week of December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had become a brutal war of endurance. The German offensive had lost much of its initial momentum, but the fighting was growing even more violent. Across the frozen forests of the Ardennes, American and German soldiers battled for every crossroads, every ridge, and every village. Snow mixed with smoke. Trees splintered under artillery fire. The roar of tanks echoed through valleys hidden beneath thick winter fog. To the German high command, victory still seemed possible, if they could break through before Allied reinforcements fully arrived. But what they didn't know was that the United States Army was about to unleash a weapon unlike anything German troops had ever encountered. It wasn't a new tank. It wasn't a jet aircraft. It wasn't a larger artillery gun. The revolution was hidden inside the nose of an ordinary artillery shell. And once those shells began exploding over German formations, the battlefield changed forever. For centuries, artillery had worked in essentially the same way. A shell struck the ground. Then it exploded. That simple sequence had shaped military tactics since the days of Napoleon. Infantrymen learned to survive by hugging the earth. They dug trenches, built foxholes, and hid behind stone walls. Even if a shell landed nearby, the ground absorbed much of the blast, and soldiers below the level of the explosion often survived. German troops were experts at this. Many had fought in Poland, France, North Africa, Italy, and on the Eastern Front. They knew exactly how to react when artillery arrived. Drop. Cover your head. Stay low. Wait for the barrage to end. That routine had saved countless lives. But the proximity fuse made those instincts dangerously outdated. Instead of exploding after impact, the shell exploded before impact, usually 20 to 50 feet above the ground. It happened so quickly that there was almost no warning. One moment, soldiers heard the familiar whistle of incoming artillery. The next, the explosion came directly overhead. The effect was devastating. An airburst scattered thousands of steel fragments in every direction. Instead of driving fragments sideways into the earth, the explosion rained them downward over a wide area. Foxholes that once provided protection suddenly became exposed. Tree branches shattered into deadly wooden splinters. Snowbanks offered little cover. Even soldiers lying flat on the ground could be struck from above. Entire platoons found themselves caught in lethal showers of steel. American artillery officers quickly noticed the difference. Reports from the front described German attacks breaking apart almost instantly. Columns advancing across open fields suddenly scattered in confusion. Machine gun crews abandoned carefully prepared firing positions. Mortar teams disappeared before they could return fire. Forward observers described something they had rarely witnessed before. Instead of enemy units reorganizing after a barrage, many simply stopped advancing altogether. One American artillery officer later recalled watching German infantry emerge from a tree line in company-sized formations. The observer calmly transmitted coordinates over the radio. Within minutes, dozens of artillery batteries answered the call. Hundreds of shells screamed toward the target. The first explosions burst above the trees. Then another. Then dozens more. The forest erupted. Tree trunks snapped like matchsticks. Snow exploded into towering white clouds. Branches, ice, and razor-sharp steel fragments filled the air. When the smoke cleared, the German formation had vanished. Not because every soldier had been killed, but because the attack itself had completely disintegrated. Survivors fled in every direction. Commanders lost contact with their men. Entire assaults collapsed before reaching American lines. German veterans immediately realized something was different. Traditional artillery had always been terrifying. This was something else. Survivors described shells that seemed to explode in the sky. Many believed American forces had developed a completely new type of weapon. Some thought aircraft were dropping bombs. Others suspected timed fuses had somehow become impossibly accurate. Few guessed the truth. The shell itself was making the decision. Inside every proximity fuse was a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. As the shell spun through the air, sometimes rotating hundreds of times every second, it continuously emitted tiny radio waves. Those waves reflected back from the ground. As long as the shell remained high in the sky, the returning signal stayed weak. But as it descended, the reflected signal grew stronger. At precisely the right distance, the electronic circuit activated. Milliseconds later, the shell detonated. No human timing. No guesswork. No dependence on striking the ground. The shell simply knew. Creating such a weapon had required one of the greatest scientific collaborations of the Second World War. American physicists, engineers, mathematicians, and military researchers worked together for years under conditions of extreme secrecy. The greatest obstacle wasn't inventing miniature radar. It was making it survive being fired. Imagine placing a delicate wristwatch inside a cannon. Now imagine firing that cannon. The acceleration would destroy almost any device instantly. Yet the proximity fuse survived forces exceeding 20,000 gs. Its tiny vacuum tubes were specially reinforced. Its batteries activated only after firing. Its electronics functioned while spinning at incredible speeds through freezing winter air. Many scientists later called it one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the entire war. Even some involved in the Manhattan Project reportedly admired its complexity. American commanders quickly recognized the opportunity. Whenever German troops gathered for an attack, proximity-fused artillery struck first. Whenever armored columns paused because of traffic, airburst shells followed. Whenever infantry attempted to organize inside forests, explosions erupted overhead. The dense woods of the Ardennes actually increased the weapon's effectiveness. Tree bursts became especially deadly. A shell exploding above the canopy shattered branches into thousands of wooden spears. Combined with steel fragments from the shell itself, the result created a deadly storm falling from every direction. German soldiers who had survived years of combat suddenly found their experience offering little protection. The battlefield had changed, but only one side fully understood why. One American infantry captain later described watching a German attack begin across a snow-covered field. Hundreds of enemy soldiers advanced with discipline despite machine gun fire. They appeared determined to overwhelm the American position. Then artillery arrived. The first airbursts erupted over the lead companies. Within seconds, the entire attack dissolved. Some soldiers dropped instantly. Others ran for cover. Officers tried desperately to regroup their men. But every attempt brought another wave of explosions. By the time the barrage ended, the assault no longer existed as an organized fighting force. The captain reportedly remarked that it looked less like a battle, and more like an army simply disappearing. German commanders faced an impossible dilemma. Stopping meant allowing the Allies to strengthen their defenses. Continuing meant advancing into artillery unlike anything they had previously encountered. Some units attempted night attacks. Others spread out into smaller formations. Several avoided roads entirely. Nothing solved the problem completely. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the battlefield. Every exposed movement carried greater risk. Every assembly area became vulnerable. Every pause invited destruction from above. The offensive that depended on speed was now slowing under relentless American fire. And with each passing day, another enemy prepared to return. The weather. For nearly a week, thick clouds had grounded Allied aircraft. German commanders knew their offensive had to succeed before the skies cleared. Because once American and British fighters returned, their already fragile supply lines would face constant attack. Then on December 23rd, the clouds finally began to break. Sunlight pierced the gray winter sky for the first time in days. For American soldiers, it was a welcome sight. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of the end. Because now they would face not only devastating artillery armed with revolutionary proximity fuses, but also the full power of Allied air superiority. Hitler's final gamble was about to unravel from both the sky and the ground. The battle that shocked Germany. December 23, 1944. For nearly a week, the Ardennes had been trapped beneath an endless blanket of cloud, snow, and freezing fog. The miserable weather had been one of Germany's greatest allies. Allied aircraft, which normally ruled the skies over Western Europe, had remained grounded. German armored columns moved through forests and villages with far less fear of air attack. But on the morning of December 23rd, everything changed. The gray clouds slowly began to break apart. Sunlight pierced the frozen landscape. For thousands of American soldiers, it was the most beautiful sight they had seen in days. For the German army, it was the beginning of disaster. As visibility improved, the engines of Allied aircraft filled the sky. First came reconnaissance planes, then fighter escorts. Soon afterward, waves of American and British fighter bombers roared across the Ardennes. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, North American P-51 Mustangs, British Hawker Typhoons. 4 days they had been waiting on airfields across France and Belgium, unable to fly. Now they attacked with overwhelming force. German supply convoys became their first targets. Fuel trucks erupted into flames. Horse-drawn wagons scattered into nearby forests. Bridges were bombed repeatedly. Columns that had once stretched confidently along narrow roads suddenly became perfect targets from the air. Pilots later described seeing miles of German vehicles trapped bumper to bumper along snow-covered highways. Some attacks lasted only seconds. the destruction lasted much longer. Every destroyed fuel truck created another problem. Every burning ammunition carrier delayed another armored division. Every cratered road forced another traffic jam. The offensive had always depended upon speed. Now, speed was disappearing. Panzer commanders watched helplessly as precious gasoline burned inside shattered tankers. Some crews abandoned perfectly functional tanks simply because they had no fuel left. Others siphoned gasoline from damaged vehicles just to continue moving. Entire units slowed to a crawl. The timetable Hitler demanded was becoming impossible. But the danger didn't come only from above. Waiting on the ground, American artillery was becoming even more deadly. As German formations struggled through frozen forests, American forward observers searched constantly for concentrations of enemy troops. Whenever they spotted movement, the radios came alive. Coordinates were transmitted. Within moments, batteries miles behind the front answered the call. The first shell screamed overhead. Then another. Then hundreds more. Unlike earlier battles of the war, these weren't ordinary artillery barrages. Many shells carried proximity fuses. German soldiers dove instinctively into foxholes. Veterans hugged the frozen earth exactly as years of combat had taught them. It made almost no difference. Explosions erupted high above the trees. Steel fragments rained downward through branches and snow. Men hiding behind logs were struck from above. Machine gun crews vanished beneath clouds of flying metal. Mortar positions disappeared almost instantly. One German survivor later recalled that the explosions seemed to come from every direction at once. He said there was nowhere to hide. The forests of the Ardennes amplified the destruction. When an airburst exploded inside the treetops, thousands of wooden splinters joined the deadly storm of steel fragments. Massive pine branches crashed toward the ground. Broken trunks became lethal projectiles. Snow exploded into blinding white clouds that made it nearly impossible to see. Officers struggled to locate their own men. Radio operators lost communication. Medical teams found it difficult to reach the wounded. Entire attacks dissolved into confusion before reaching American defensive positions. For many German infantrymen, the forest itself seemed to turn against them. Nowhere was German frustration greater than around the small Belgian town of Bastogne. Although relatively unknown before the battle, Bastogne sat at the intersection of several critical roads. Control of those roads meant control of the entire offensive. German commanders knew they had to capture the town quickly. Instead, American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units, reached Bastogne just in time. Within days they were completely surrounded. Food became scarce. Medical supplies ran dangerously low. Winter clothing was inadequate. German artillery pounded the town continuously. Yet the defenders refused to surrender. When German representatives demanded their capitulation, the American reply became legendary. Nuts. That single word spread rapidly through Allied newspapers. It became a symbol of American determination. But behind that famous response stood countless soldiers enduring freezing temperatures, constant shelling, and repeated attacks. They survived because artillery and reinforcements never stopped supporting them. Outside Bastogne, German forces attempted attack after attack. Each advance met fierce resistance. Whenever infantry assembled for another assault, American observers called for artillery. The skies exploded again. Proximity-fused shells burst over roads, open fields, and tree lines. German momentum faded with every barrage. Officers who expected rapid breakthroughs instead found themselves reorganizing shattered companies. Experienced non-commissioned officers disappeared. Junior officers assumed command. Entire platoons became mixed together after every bombardment. Discipline remained strong. Morale did not. Many soldiers realized they were fighting an enemy with overwhelming firepower. Meanwhile, Allied air superiority grew stronger every day. Transport aircraft flew desperately needed supplies into Bastogne. Pilots dropped ammunition, food, blankets, medicine, and fuel despite enemy fire. At the same time, fighter bombers continued attacking German positions across the Ardennes. Bridges collapsed. Rail lines were destroyed. Fuel depots erupted into towering fireballs visible for miles. Without fuel, German tanks became stationary targets. Without ammunition, artillery batteries fell silent. Without transportation, reinforcements arrived too late. Hitler's carefully planned offensive slowly began falling apart. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because modern industrial warfare rewarded logistics as much as bravery. The United States could replace losses. Germany no longer could. German commanders desperately searched for solutions. Some proposed shortening the front. Others recommended retreating before their armies became trapped. Hitler rejected nearly every suggestion. He insisted the offensive continue. He demanded impossible victories from exhausted divisions. Each new order required troops to attack again despite shrinking supplies and mounting casualties. The result was predictable. Every fresh assault encountered the same deadly combination. American artillery, American aircraft, American reinforcements. Together, they created a wall of fire that Germany could no longer overcome. Many historians later argued that the Battle of the Bulge marked more than Germany's final offensive in the West. It demonstrated a new kind of warfare. Technology, industrial production, communications, and logistics combined to overwhelm even highly experienced armies. The proximity fuse symbolized that transformation. German soldiers had prepared for traditional artillery. Instead, they encountered precision airbursts that shattered formations before they reached the battlefield. Some officers reportedly believed American artillery had become almost supernatural. They couldn't explain why explosions always seemed perfectly timed. The answer remained hidden inside every shell. A tiny electronic device, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, powerful enough to alter the course of battle. By the final days of December, the initiative had passed completely to the Allies. German armored spearheads no longer advanced. Instead, they fought desperately simply to survive. American divisions launched counterattacks across the frozen landscape. British forces secured the northern flank. Fresh armored units pushed steadily toward surrounded positions. The giant bulge in the Allied front began shrinking day by day. Hitler's last great gamble was failing. His armies had achieved surprise. They had demonstrated remarkable courage. But surprise alone could not overcome overwhelming Allied production, superior logistics, air superiority, and one revolutionary invention that turned the winter skies of the Ardennes into a deadly battlefield. The final chapter of the Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and when the snow finally settled, the consequences would shape not only the end of World War II, but the future of warfare itself. Legacy of the Invisible Explosion. January 1945. The snow still covered the forests of the Ardennes, but the momentum of the battle had changed completely. Just 3 weeks earlier, German commanders believed they were marching toward one of the greatest victories of the war. Now, their armies were fighting simply to escape destruction. The roads that had once carried confident panzer columns westward were filled with abandoned tanks, burned-out trucks, shattered artillery pieces, and exhausted soldiers retreating back toward Germany. Hitler's last great offensive had failed. The dream of capturing Antwerp had vanished. The hope of splitting the Allied armies had disappeared. Germany had gambled everything, and lost. The cost was staggering. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States Army. More than 600,000 American troops eventually participated in the campaign. Thousands never returned home. By the time the fighting ended in late January 1945, the Allies had suffered approximately 75,000 to 90,000 casualties, including those killed, wounded, missing, and captured. German losses were similarly devastating. Historians estimate that Germany suffered between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties. But unlike the United States, Germany could no longer replace those losses. Every experienced tank commander killed, every veteran artillery officer lost, every skilled mechanic, engineer, and infantry leader represented experience the German army would never recover. The Battle of the Bulge didn't simply cost Germany soldiers. It consumed the last operational reserve Hitler possessed in Western Europe. Perhaps even more damaging was the loss of equipment. Hundreds of German tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Thousands of trucks disappeared. Fuel stocks, already critically low, were exhausted. Aircraft were lost faster than they could be replaced. Factories deep inside Germany continued producing weapons, but Allied bombing campaigns constantly disrupted production. Raw materials became scarce. Transportation networks collapsed. The German war machine was literally running out of time. Only 4 months after the Battle of the Bulge ended, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. Looking back, many historians see the Ardennes offensive as Hitler's final opportunity to change the course of the war. Once it failed, the outcome became almost inevitable. Yet among all the tanks, aircraft, and armies that shaped the battle, one invention stood apart: the proximity fuse. At first glance, it seemed almost insignificant. A small electronic device hidden inside an artillery shell, invisible to soldiers, rarely photographed. almost never celebrated in wartime propaganda. But its impact reached far beyond the snowy forests of Belgium. Military historians frequently rank the proximity fuse alongside radar, code breaking, and the atomic bomb as one of the most important technological breakthroughs of World War II. Not because it looked impressive, because it fundamentally changed how artillery worked. Before 1944, artillery relied heavily on impact or carefully timed mechanical fuses. Both had limitations. Mechanical timers required precise calculations. Small errors caused shells to explode too early or too late. Impact fuses buried much of their explosive force in the ground. The proximity fuse solved both problems simultaneously. Every shell automatically detonated at nearly the ideal height. No adjustment. No complicated timing. No guesswork. The battlefield itself determined the perfect moment. That innovation dramatically increased the effectiveness of artillery against infantry, aircraft, and lightly armored vehicles. It also forced armies around the world to rethink battlefield tactics. Traditional foxholes no longer guaranteed safety. Infantry formations spread farther apart. Defensive positions became deeper and more sophisticated. Even after World War II ended, military planners across the globe redesigned doctrine to account for airburst artillery. The invisible explosion had permanently rewritten the rules of combat. German officers who studied the battle after the war were astonished. Many admitted they had never fully understood why American artillery became so devastating during the Ardennes campaign. Some initially believed the Allies had simply improved their accuracy. Others suspected overwhelming numbers explained the destruction. Only later did they learn about the proximity fuse. The realization shocked many military analysts. Germany had produced remarkable weapons during the war. Jet fighters. Yet in one crucial area, the Allies had quietly achieved technological superiority that Germany never matched. Sometimes the most revolutionary weapon isn't the largest. Sometimes it fits inside the palm of your hand. The proximity fuse also demonstrated another important truth about modern warfare. Winning battles isn't determined solely by bravery. Courage matters. Leadership matters. Determination matters. But technology, science, manufacturing, logistics, and communication often decide whether that courage succeeds or fails. The United States entered World War II with enormous industrial capacity. Factories that once produced automobiles began building tanks. Typewriter manufacturers built machine guns. Refrigerator companies manufactured aircraft components. Scientists worked alongside engineers, soldiers, and factory workers. Together, they created weapons that gave Allied forces critical advantages on the battlefield. The proximity fuse became one of the greatest examples of that cooperation. It wasn't invented by one genius working alone. It resulted from thousands of people solving countless engineering problems over several years. Every successful airburst over the Ardennes represented years of research hidden inside a single shell. Today, visitors walking through the peaceful forests of Belgium often find it difficult to imagine the violence that once consumed those hills. The trees have grown back. The villages have been rebuilt. Snow still falls during winter, covering the landscape in quiet white silence. Yet beneath that peaceful surface lies one of history's most important battlefields. Museums display uniforms, rifles, helmets, and damaged vehicles recovered from the forest. Memorials honor soldiers from every nation who fought there. Veterans who survived the battle often remembered not only the freezing temperatures or the constant danger, but also the deafening roar of artillery echoing through endless woods. Some described explosions that seemed to come from the sky itself. At the time, few understood why. The Battle of the Bulge reminds us that history often turns on moments hidden from public view. Most people remember the famous names: Bastogne, Patton, Eisenhower, Hitler, the 101st Airborne, the Panzer Divisions. Yet behind every famous battle are quieter stories. Stories of engineers designing circuits, scientists testing miniature vacuum tubes, factory workers assembling components, artillery crews loading shells, forward observers making calm radio calls under enemy fire. Each played a role in shaping history. None stood alone. In the end, Germany's final offensive failed for many reasons. Fuel shortages, overextended supply lines, American resilience, Allied air superiority, superior logistics, overwhelming industrial production, strong leadership. Each factor mattered. But among them was one technological breakthrough that multiplied the power of every artillery battery that used it. The proximity fuse transformed ordinary shells into precision airburst weapons. It caught experienced soldiers completely by surprise. It shattered attacks before they reached American lines. And during one of the darkest winters of World War II, it helped stop Hitler's final gamble. Today, nearly 80 years later, the echoes of those explosions have faded. The battlefields are quiet. The forests have healed. The soldiers are gone. But the lessons remain. Innovation can change history. Science can alter the outcome of war. And sometimes, the smallest invention leaves the largest mark. Because in the frozen skies above the Ardennes, it wasn't just artillery that fell upon advancing German formations. It was the arrival of a new era of warfare. An era where technology, precision, and innovation would shape every battlefield that followed. And in that bitter winter of 1944, the Germans learned that lesson in the most devastating way imaginable. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to see more untold stories from World War II, forgotten battles, secret weapons, and the incredible moments that changed history forever, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. If this video taught you something new, hit the like button. It helps more history enthusiasts discover our content. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the proximity fuse was one of the most important inventions of World War II? Or was there another technology that had an even greater impact on the outcome of the war? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.